today to one of the more difficult, really difficult biblical books, the book of Job. And I mean difficult in several senses. But before we start unpacking all the complications and start digging into it a little bit and seeing what we can make of it, I just want to give a short survey of what's in the book so that we're all on the same page. The book starts with this really and truly bizarre scenario. And it's bizarre because we're not used to watching God talking to angels randomly, just for no, like just so in our holy writings. And yet the book of Job starts exactly like this. It starts with God having some conference with his messengers, and Satan comes back from walking around the land. And God tells him, did you see my slave, my servant, Job, who is such a wonderful man, such a good man, such a tzaddik, always helps the poor, always does everything that's right, such a righteous man. And Satan says, well, yeah, but maybe he's only righteous because his life is good, because he's rich and respected and has a nice family. And, he's a billionaire, he's an affluential person. Maybe he's only good because of that. And it's a very interesting moment because we're used to the question of tzaddik v'ralo, right? Tzaddik v'ralo, tzaddik v'tovlo. Like, how come a righteous man might suffer? How come somebody can be a tzaddik and have bad things happening to him? But here, Satan comes and kind of turns the tables and he says, forget for a second, what is the reward? Maybe he's only tzaddik because everything is good for him. He's like, tovlo v'tzaddik. Everything is good for him and therefore he's tzaddik. And God gives permission to Satan to put Job to the trial, to start experimenting, to taking away and ruining all those things that made his life so wonderful, and see if that pushes him away from being the righteous man he is. And the test is not, will he continue to be kind and generous to other people? The test is, will he renounce God? Will he declare God unjust in some way? In other words, the test of righteousness is very specific. It's really a credo, a faith taste of, will his faith in God be shaken by his life being changed? And at first, Satan fails. Satan causes all of Job's riches to be lost. Worse, he causes his 10 children to die. And yet, Job doesn't curse God, doesn't renounce God. Let's look together in the source sheet at what Job does do. Job says these words. I'm here in box 3 in the source sheet in Job 120. When Job arose, tore his robe, cut off his hair, and threw himself on the ground and worshipped. He said, naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord has given, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Ha'el natan v'ha'el lakach, yehi shem Hashem mevorach. This is something we still say to this day when people die. For all this, Job did not sin, nor did he cast reproach on God. But Satan is unpleased. Satan feels that this is not a conclusive proof that Job's righteousness did not depend on his extraordinary good fortune. Because he said, okay, so he lost his children and he lost his riches, but he himself is not suffering physically. He's still intact. So God gives permission to Satan to take this weird trial one step further. And Job comes to suffer from horrible diseases. At this point, Job's wife is already losing her faith. And we're here in the next source. His wife said to him, you will keep your integrity? Blaspheme God and die. Interestingly, in Hebrew, it says, Barech Elokim, bless God. But this is a euphemism. It means curse God and just die. Be done with it. This life is not worth it. But he said to her, your talk as any shameless woman might talk. Should we accept only good from God and not accept evil? For all that, Job said nothing sinful. The commentators point out that there is progression here. That at first we heard that Job did not sin, nor did he cast reproach on God. In the second one, we already hear he didn't say anything sinful, which might hint that he's already starting to feel bitterness. He's not happy with God anymore, but he's still holding on. He's repressing it. He realized that he shouldn't express it. He's not identifying himself with any rebellion against God. And then at this moment, which is a low moment, we discover that Job still has one thing. Despite the fact that his kids and riches and body are gone, that his relationship with his wife is clearly fractured in some way, he still has friends. 3 friends come from far away and for 7 long days sit with him in silence and commiserate with him. And it's almost a moment of comfort, right? It's a moment of, oh, look, there's still someone there for him. But then after 7 days, Job speaks up. He breaks the silence, and instead of saying again, God gave and God took, may God be blessed, or saying, I came here naked and naked I shall leave, or saying, just as we accept the good, we should accept the bad. Instead, he says, I wish I wasn't born. He curses the day he was born. Now, he's still not attacking God. He's not saying God is unjust to bring these disasters upon me, even though I'm a righteous man. He doesn't say that. But he says, this life, as it is not worth it for me. I wish I was dead. And at this moment of despair, his friends who were there in silence with him for 7 days break their silence too. And what we see is a series of speeches. Time and time again, 3 times in fact, the 3 friends make these speeches, and 3 times Job rejects what they have to say. And what they have to say is exceedingly harsh. Because instead of saying, oh, Job, we're so sorry you're suffering, what the friends seem to be primarily preoccupied with is trying to explain to him why God must be right. The friends, it's just, they can't let it stand that maybe God has wronged their friend by bringing disasters upon him, or that maybe God doesn't care and somebody else brought, they can't, their theological worldview is there in their mind and they can't allow it to be challenged, even though at first Job doesn't challenge it directly. And they invest themselves in trying to explain to him that if he's suffering, he must be in the wrong. Let's look at it for a second. We're going to pause to discuss in a minute. I just want to show you some of what they say. It starts mildly enough in Job 5. See how happy is a man whom God reproves. Do not reject the discipline of the Almighty. He injures, but he binds up. He wounds, but his hands heal. This still sounds rather friendly, right? It sounds like they're saying, here, you are a friend. We love you. We'll, like we want you to love God. Don't allow it to make you not love God. And then slowly they start telling him, well, since God is so just, you should know that if God has punished you, that if you're hurt, it means it's a punishment, which means that you need to repent. And they preemptively try and tell Job, don't bother arguing with this. They tell him here at the end of chapter 5, I'm here at box 4, see, we have inquired into this and it is so. Hear it and accept it. It's as if they preemptively want to stop him from speaking up against what they're saying. They just keep laying it thick. They're saying, you must have sinned. We know you don't know how you have sinned, but you should repent. You should repent. You should repent. You should repent. Now, before we talk about how Job responds to this and how the ideas develop as they go into round 2 and round 3 of such speeches, I'd like to open this for discussion with you and ask you, it's not a specific question, it's more general than this. When you read this, when you hear this story from the moment of God meeting Satan until this moment, when the friends are trying to convince Job that God is fair and just, how does it make you feel? How do you respond to that?
Well, since we have the backstory that this is all some sort of cruel test, when we hear the friends saying what might be a sort of theological and response to the situation, that one might have heard or considered as an appropriate, maybe an appropriate response. It's cruelly ironic that they're giving this speech when we have the backstory that no, it isn't just, it isn't.
You're saying that the fact that we know the reasons make their attempts to put the reason on Job's shoulders, or on Job's conscience, pathetic in a sense, because we know they're wrong.
Right. And it then undermines for us that is an appropriate response when such things happen.
You're saying that going out of the book already, like for our own life, it makes us wonder, are we right to make these kinds of responses? It almost characterizes. Yes, Rebecca.
I think in the larger picture, I mean, I'm always fascinated by it because, because we're looking at it, and maybe because we know in the end he gets a family again, or something. I mean, it sort of is some person, and there are different theories on where did it happen, was it, who wrote it, whatever, trying to grapple with the fact that there's, is God involved in, I mean, like, what kind of God would do this? Okay. Like, what kind of God would come up with this? I mean, we're talking about losing all of his children. And then, I mean, I've read a bit of it before, like the Meforshim saying, well, his kids, he sacrificed and they didn't agree, all the trying to justify all the death and destruction and pain, which is not justifiable in this world where morality and Torah and justice should reign. I don't know, it's always so disturbing. It doesn't matter how many times I hear it or read it. To me, it's just like, it's just disturbing. I don't know. So that's not real. I don't know. You're getting all the things that just go through my mind when we think about these things. So.
I relate to that, Rebecca, and I have to say that I had a similar response, and it was kind of funny to me when I realized that the premise of the story, right, is that God makes Job live through suffering to test whether he's going to believe in God, even when it appears that God is unjust. And it's almost the story of Job does the same thing to us, because it presents to us a situation. We're not suffering like Job, I hope. I mean, God willing. We're not suffering like Job, but we're watching a story where God behaves in ways that seem patently unjust to us. And it's almost as if the book is challenging us to keep faith while reading it. It's like
almost
we are
sadistic.
placed in the same position.
Sadistic,
we're placed in the same
almost.
position. Yes, there's definitely an element of that. By the way, just Eileen, just in a second, but there's a big machloket, a big disagreement amongst the Amoraim in the time of the Gemara about whether this is a story that really happened or not. Rabbi Yochanan, the big Gemara, said that it's a story that really happened. Resh Lakish famously said that there's no way it could have happened. God would never do that. That is not something God does. This is a parable that's meant to kind of create a mental exercise to try and make us think about what does it mean to have faith in extreme circumstances. And Maimonides in particular accepted this position and argued for that we can't, to say God actually did it is not something we can live with. It's a parable. And yet there are those other opinions. Eileen, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, so we have the example of God testing with Abraham, but in those cases, the tests are things that can be reversed. You bring your son, but don't kill him. It's saved at the end, and that caused a lot of, and even that caused a lot of strains in the commentaries commenting on causing Sarah's death and so on. Or having someone be barren and then reversing it when they're old or later on. But all those things are tribulations you can live through, and then it can get reversed. And these are not, or not all of them are things that can get reversed. And
No.
so it's a different kind of test that, as everyone already said, it doesn't sit right.
Yeah, and yes, Rebecca, I wanted to comment on that.
I'm just shaking my head because as much as Eileen is right in that, yes, there can be some form of happier ending, it's all very disturbing. It's all the idea that a son is almost killed by his father, the idea that a woman suffers for years and years without children. We all, unfortunately, many of us know couples in that situation. This is not, it's not a trifle, like something that you just toss, oh, well, it was just a few years, It's a lot of pain and a lot of anguish. For me, it's very hard. Even that, this is much more, I agree, Eileen, but at the same time, I don't know. I can't just toss it off and say, well, because what kind of God does that? That's all.
So Rebecca, I think you capture very well, in a sense, what the book wants us to feel. I don't think the book is trying to make us feel, oh God, we submit to you. The book is working hard to make us grapple with the challenge of what it means to live in a world where, whether we know it or not, like whether we have direct information about God's intentions or not, things don't seem right. Things don't seem fair. Things don't seem like they're for the good. And it's, and I think it's important to kind of hold on to this feeling. And I'll get back to this in the end, to what the book wants us to do with this feeling, but it's important to acknowledge that. Anne, you wanted to say something? I got the impression you were trying to say something.
Maybe was just thinking through my face. I've always read it as parable, but that only helps a little bit, because I think it sets it up clearly as through what does it mean to be a tzaddik in this world. But what it does is it throws you into the world, and it makes us cognizant of all the aspects of our actual life in the world, as living with all the finite, unknowable aspects of what it means to be a little human being in a big world that we don't really fully know and don't really fully understand, and all those challenges that we face without simple answers.
I agree. I think it's more than that, because you can find yourself living in the world and suffer and not be perturbed by it if you don't also want to believe that there's a just God out there, right? If you just think everything is chance, then, maybe it's a scary way to live. I'm not saying it doesn't come with its own set of problems, but it doesn't create a dissonance inside you. But when you want to believe that there is a God, and the God is just and providential and cares about what happens on earth, and then you look and see people die in the Holocaust, or we don't need to go that far, Job is kind of an extreme book, so the Holocaust feels like an appropriate comparison, but just people suffer for no reason. People going on vacation to Italy and being on I don't know how you call it in English. Rachbal,
Cable car,
and crashing and dying, just like in a freak accident, or you see all these things happening, and it's just not, if you also want to believe that there's a God who orders the world and it's very distressing. It's not just distressing in and of itself because suffering is distressing. It's distressing because it feels like a contradiction. And there's another aspect of it, and here I do want to follow what Eileen said about the difference between the nisyonot, the trials in Job, and in, let's say, Abraham's story, which is the other big story of trials, right? in Abraham's case, we know why God is doing it. It may be unjust. It may not be like nice, because instead of being rewarded for being a righteous man, Abraham is thrown into greater and greater difficulties. But God tells us over and over again that Abraham has some mission to carry out. And the mission requires that he will be the best version he can be. And to be that, he needs to be tried, not to prove something, but in order to force him to rise to the moment and be more and more and more. We hear that, I'll show you in the source sheet, even though it's not directly about that. But when God talks to Abraham about Sodom, when he informs him about his decision to ruin Sodom, it's in the first books, he says, now the Lord had said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do, since Abraham is to become a great and populous nation, and all the nations of the earth are to bless themselves by him, etc., etc. There's a certain sense that like he's tried because he's being prepared for a certain ordeal, for a certain legacy. In Job's case, he's not prepared for anything. It's really literally a science experiment to see, is he going to abandon his faith or not? Which feels, it's like it takes it to the extreme. It doesn't serve anything other than intellectual dispute between God and Satan, at least in the terms of the book. What's extraordinary also is not just that this book, but okay, so I'll take a step back and I'll say, what's extraordinary here is that all these things we just said that are so critical of God, they're not some modern interpretation of the book. They're the book. The book is written in a way that's meant to elicit this very strong negative critical reaction in us. The test, the kind of the point of the book is to see, can we hold with one hand this negative reaction, and with one hand our faith in God, and somehow keep them both, just like Job is expected to do, to hold on to his suffering and to his faith. We are expected to somehow do that. We're not expected to do that by trying to make the criticism go away. This is what the friends are trying to do. And as we will see in a minute, the friends are criticized for it by God himself. The friends were trying to say, well, if you're suffering, it must be you sinned, or it must be for the good, or all those things that we all know, right? It's platitudes we hear when we suffer, and sometimes we say them also because we don't know what else to say. That's the bad response in the book. In the book, this is presented as the negative way to deal with suffering in the world. The real way is somehow to hold on to this perplexity, to hold on to the impossibility, and yet have faith through it. And it's remarkable that the Bible includes a book that is inviting us to question God's justice, that is forcing us, I would say, to question God's justice. And it's not a book that's in a vacuum. The idea that people have to question God's justice, that have room to question God's justice, is an idea that's already there from the first man of faith, Abraham himself. Not some heretic we can dismiss easily as an inappropriate role model, right? The first man of faith himself is also the first who comes to God and says, no, you're unjust. You can't do this thing. Let's read it together. We just started it, but let's continue. God tells Abraham that he is about to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. It's in the first box of the source sheet, and Abraham disagrees. Abraham came forward and said, will you sweep away the innocent along with the guilty? What if there should be 50 innocent within the city? Will you then wipe out the place and not forgive it for the sake of the innocent 50 who are in it? Abraham comes and says, how can you, the just God of the world, kill an innocent person because somebody else sinned? How can you violate what is so obvious to us, me and you, Abraham and God, right, as justice? How can you violate it, and how can it stand? And Abraham does more than that. He doesn't merely ask, he also attacks in the next verse here, in verse 25. Far be it from you. In Hebrew, it's chalila lecha, to do such a thing, to bring death upon the innocent as well as the guilty. so that innocent and guilty fare alike. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly? And as we know, God doesn't say, how dare you, Abraham? How can you talk to me like that? God agrees. God says, yes, if there were 50 people, I would spare them. And Abraham keeps asking and going down and down and down. And it turns out that there's no more than 10 people. And if we calculate later, we see that God did save the people who were still just in the city. This was Lot and his family. And the city is ruined by justice. In other words, God agrees with two things. God agrees with Abraham's assumption that God himself, the judge of the earth, should act justly. And God agrees that Abraham, as a human being, has the right to demand it. So already in that first story, we see that the Jewish Bible, the Hebrew Bible, wants us to speak up. Man has the right to demand justice from God. Now, in later books and in the Nevi'im and the prophets, the issue of how can we reconcile the idea that God is just with what we see in the world, which is righteous people suffering and bad people prospering, does make an appearance time and time again. But the prophets mostly resolve it by saying things like, okay, maybe people are inheriting either the prosperity or the punishment of their parents. Maybe sometimes the punishment is so earned that there's collateral damage, and it's just because a whole society, so much of it is rotten that it can't stand. They're more or less trying to make peace with that. They're trying to find ways to kind of work with it, which makes a lot of sense because the prophets are still, at the end of the day, speaking in the name of God. Their job is to bring God's message to the world. And as they educate the people around them, they're trying to make people see the world from God's perspective. But then as we leave the Nevi'im, the Torah and the Nevi'im behind, and we go into the books of the Ketuvim, the third part of the Hebrew Bible, we start seeing voices that rise not so much from God, but from the people themselves. And that long tradition of people demanding justice from God, again, comes to the fore. And once again, the grappling with the problems that come from trying to hold on to the idea that God is just, and to grapple with reality and acknowledge that there's things that we don't understand that seem unfair in reality, again, start taking center stage. Now, we already saw it a little bit in Tehillim. We didn't talk about it in our classes, but Tehillim have that, and have that question of how can it be that there are bad people who seem to prosper? And the Psalms seem to offer this interesting approach to a solution. Let's look at it together, just to put Job in context a little bit. I'm going to read Psalm 73 in the second box, a psalm of Asaph. God is truly good to Israel, to those whose heart is pure. As for me, my feet had almost stayed. My steps were nearly led off course, for I envied the wanton. I saw the wicked at ease. And and it goes on, and he describes all these descriptions of how happy the wicked people he sees are, how prosperous, how their children are successful, how everything seems to be going well for them. And he kind of starts questioning whether it makes sense, whether God can be just, whether there's just reward in the world. And he says, just a minute. He says, how can it be? How could God know? Is there knowledge with the Most High? Such are the wicked, ever tranquil. They amass wealth. It was for nothing that I kept my heart pure and washed my hands in innocence, seeing that I have been constantly afflicted, that each morning brings new punishments. But then, at the end of the same psalm, he reaches the conclusion that he was wrong, because he expected reward and punishment to be expressed in physical terms. But that's not the ultimate good. The ultimate good that he gets from living a good life, in the sense of righteous life, is different. As for me, nearness to God is good. I have made the Lord God my refuge, that I may recount all your works. In other words, this particular psalm deals with the problem of suffering in the world, of good people suffering, by saying our whole assumptions about what it means to be rewarded for our good deeds are mistaken, because we look for physical rewards. We look for prosperity. It's a very Calvin-like idea that that people who are good should get, business prosperity, basically. And he says, this is not what it is. What happens is that the good path, living a life of righteous deeds, is its own rewards because it brings you close to God. And there's nothing sweeter or better than that. We see similar ideas in modern thought when people say, or it's not just modern, but it's a little bit post-biblical, when people say you get the reward in Gan Eden. Yes, you don't get the reward in this world, but you get the reward out of the world. In many ways, the idea of Gan Eden is satiated when we say, okay, there has to be just reward, and it doesn't seem like this world supplies it, right? We need to believe that there's something beyond what we see in order for the world to be just and make sense. But while this psalm and others like it, and definitely the book of Mishlei, when it grapples with similar questions, resoundingly reject the idea that God is unjust and just say, well, we may feel like that in our moment of doubts, but really we know that God is good and just and all that. Two of the books of the Ketuvim don't mince words. Don't bother to make apologies for God. Don't bother to kind of couch it in nicer terms or present it positively. And these are Job, that we're discussing today, and the book of Ecclesiastes. Both of them, no matter how they start, and I'll discuss it in a second, they start from very, very different perspectives and different points of views, present a certain j'accuse, a certain bill of indictment against God, against the way the world that God made is. In Ecclesiastes, the accusation stems from a life of luxury. The author of Ecclesiastes, according to tradition, it's Shlomo HaMelech, lives a happy life, amassing wives, amassing gold, amassing horses, enjoying all the pleasures that there are to enjoy in the world, enjoying wisdom, not just, physical pleasures, also, although those as well. But the more he enjoys the world, the more he kind of pursues what the world has to offer, the more he's struck by this deep suspicion and then conviction that the world is futile, that everything is hevel havalim, it's nothing, it's a puff of hair, that nothing has lasting meaning, that you can feel pleasure, but it passes, that you can acquire wisdom, but you have no control about what will happen the next moment with everything you did with this wisdom. You might live a good and righteous life, build an empire, and then a stupid son will inherit it and break it apart. You might live your life as a good person, and then old age will catch up to you and break your body and your spirit. It just does not seem right that the world is like that. And Ecclesiastes decries it and just rejects the idea that there's anything meaningful in the world. In Job's case, the crucible from which his kind of bill of indictment against God emerges is the opposite. It's suffering. It's not being able to pursue enjoyment. As long as Job is happy and prosperous and successful, not only is he not questioning meaning in life, he is bringing meaning to other people's life. He's a teacher. He's a big man of good deeds. He supports the widows and the poor and the orphans and the strangers and the travelers. There's a lot of talk in the book of Job about how many acts of loving kindness he does. But then when he suffers, and worse, when his friends, and this is why I paused at that spot before, when his friends accuse him, when his friends say, not only do you suffer, the suffering must mean that you're in the wrong, that's when Job loses his kind of resignation, his stance of resignation of God gave, God took, I will accept that, and starts attacking. Let's look at some of what he says together.
Rachel,
Yes.
who wrote it? Who wrote Job?
That's an excellent question, and there's arguments about it in Midrash. If I'm not mistaken, there is a Midrash that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote it. I don't remember exactly if that's the only one. I didn't look into it recently. I can look into it again and see all the options, and we can talk about it next time when we meet. Okay.
Yeah.
But I remember, like, what I saw, one of the Midrashim I saw is that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote it, and that that it was meant to be kind of, Moshe left us the national legacy in the Torah, right? Like the national legacy, but he also left us a personal legacy of what it means to be a person in the world. And this is his personal legacy. But again, that's only one midrash, and I'm not sure what to tell you beyond that. Let's look a little bit at some of the things that Job says, because the interesting thing is that Job doesn't come out and say, God, you are unjust. Unlike Satan's expectations, contrary to Satan's expectation, at no point does Job just say, I reject God, I don't believe in God, or I don't believe in God's providence, or I don't believe that God is the just judge of the world that I expect. That's not what he says. What he says is, there is a reality, and the reality shows me injustice. He doesn't say, and you, God, are at fault. He just says, here's the reality. I'm not going to make it go away. I'm not going like my friends to pretend that it must make sense. This is a reality and it doesn't make sense. And he describes this reality. I just brought one of many examples here in box 5. Why do the wicked live on, prosper and grow wealthy? Their children are with them always, and they see their children's children. Their homes are secure without fear. They do not feel the rod of the God. They spend their days in happiness and go down to Sheol in peace. How can we live with that? But then he goes beyond that. He says something else. He says, not only do I see injustice, and I refuse to accept attempts to explain this justice away under some thin theological veneer. Why is it even that God punishes people or reward? Like, why is it that God should bring suffering on people, even if they sinned, when God is so great and we are so small? The whole idea of divine justice, there's something wrong and almost absurd, or what's the word I'm looking for? Twisted about it. It's almost obscene when you think about how grand God is and how flawed we are. Why should God bring down his wrath on us, even if we sin? How can that be just? And let's read it together here. Keep quiet, I will have my say, come what may upon me. How long? I will take my flesh in my teeth, I will take my life in my hands. He may well slay me, I may have no hope, yet I will argue my case before him. In this too is my salvation, that no impious man can come into his presence. Listen closely to my words, give ear to my discourse. See now, I have prepared a case. I know that I will win it. For who is it that would challenge me? I should then keep silent and expire. Just a minute, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. He says, remove your hand from me and let not your terror frighten me. Then summon me and I will respond, or I will speak and you reply to me. How many are my iniquities and sins? Advise me of my transgressions and sins. Is not, it didn't get to that part yet. He still says, you, my friends, are saying that I'm suffering and punishment. Well, where are my sins? Prove that I have sins. I don't have any sins. God, you are bringing me to justice, God. You're putting me on trial, but actually I am putting you on trial. And I'm demanding you produce evidence, God, to justify yourself. And then he goes and says what I mentioned before in 25. Will you harass a driven leaf? Will you pursue driven up straw? That you decree for me bitter things and make me answer for the iniquities of my youth? But you put my feet in the stocks and watch all my ways, hemming in my footsteps. Man wastes away like a rotten thing, like a garment eaten by moths. And he repeats the same message elsewhere in the book. He says, How does it make sense that you will try and put judgment on me when I am so less than you? Why? Even if I deserve it, it doesn't make sense. And I don't deserve it. I challenge the world. Prove to me what I did wrong. Interestingly, instead of backing up, what the friends do is they keep kind of doubling down. If the first set of speeches, each of the friends make a speech, are still kind of mild and supportive and say, you must have sinned, be understanding. After Job rejects it, they come back more forcefully and say, you must have sinned. You really must have sinned. Everybody's a sinner. How can you say you're not a sinner? And then when he rejects it again, then they start attacking him in earnest, and they start saying, you must be the most evil person in the world because your punishment is so terrible. It must imply that you were the worst person out there. How dare you say you're not a sinner? And again, Job rejects it. Time and time again, Job says, in the name of all of us, in a sense, all of us humans who live in this world, Job speaks for us. And he says, this is too easy. This is a cop-out answer. To say if bad things happen, it must mean that there's a reason, and the reason is justified and is black and white and perfect. This is too easy. I know myself. I know that there is no way that I could have earned this kind of suffering fair and square, either because I know I didn't sin or because I know my own fallibility. I know my own humanity. How can humans earn this kind of scorn from God? And at the end of the book, God reveals himself. God comes in. The same God who started the book by having this weird conversation with Satan, God comes in and he reveals himself to Job from the storm. And here comes the weird part. What do you expect God to say at this point? Let's pretend we don't, if you know, don't, just what makes sense for God to say it at this point, in your opinion? Any guesses? Yes,
Well,
Anne?
if we're looking for answers, we want an answer, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. We ask the question, how can it be just? Right? But that's not what he says.
Right.
God says nothing. God ignores everything that was said until this point. God doesn't say, well, divine justice looks like it's unjust, but really it's just because 1, 2, 3. Well, really you did sin, or you sinned in a previous life, or your father sinned, and therefore it makes sense. Well, your suffering brought you closer to me, and this is its own reward, and therefore it's worth it. God doesn't say any of those things that might have been satisfactory in previous books and iterations of this question in the Tanakh. God doesn't say any of that. Instead, God spends several chapters explaining how grand he is and how he runs the entire natural world. Everything in the natural world stems from him. And the odd thing is, Job accepts it. Job is okay with that as an answer. And many a commentator throughout history tried to understand why this counts as an answer. Okay, this is a very nice speech. I am so grand, I'm so powerful, I run the world. What is it to do with anything? And one direction of answering it is that, in a sense, what God is telling Job is, you keep asking me questions about your little corner of the world, the human corner, your corner, Job, where you expect certain parameters of justice to be kept. And in the name of these parameters, you're inviting me to stand in the dock as the accused of your judgment. You tell me I will judge you because you're being unjust to me. But how can you stand in judgment when you don't understand me at all? When your little corner of the world is all you see, and there's all these other things beyond it that I am doing that are beyond your comprehension. And in a sense, what God is telling Job is that divine justice is not a separate, divine justice in human matters is not somehow separate from God's management of the entire world. It's a small part of something much, much bigger, something far beyond our perception and understanding. And because of that, we can't, it's not that we can't question it. The book definitely wants us to question it, but we'll never get an answer because the answer lies beyond our purview. The answer to what makes certain things just is just not something we can grasp. And interestingly, Job accepts. Does he accept because finally someone came and didn't tell him, well, you're at fault, but rather it's out of your hands? Did he accept because God revealed himself to him, and therefore, even if he can't quite make peace with his own suffering, at least he feels closeness to God, which is, as David said in the Psalms, its own reward? Did he accept because when God talks to you, you kind of have to accept because it goes beyond human reason? We don't know. God didn't reveal himself to us. We didn't get God's answer. We didn't get the fullness of God's answer. What we did get, though, is God's conclusion. Because God's conclusion has nothing to do with Job's suffering. God's conclusion has nothing to do with a question of how God treats humanity. God's conclusion at the end of it all has to do with how we treat each other. Let's look at it together. Just a minute. After I'm at the end here, at Job 42. After the Lord has spoken these words to Job, the Lord said to, and these words are the description of how he controls nature. The Lord said to Eliphaz Temanite. Eliphaz Temanite was the leader of the three friends with their speeches. I am incensed at you and your two friends, for you have not spoken the truth about me as did my servant Job. In other words, you who thought you were defending me in the trial that where Job was the accuser and I was the accused, you did not speak truth. You spoke lies. You blamed Job, who's blameless here, to justify me. And I don't want that. I don't need that from you. My servant Job, with all his accusations, with all his discontent, he spoke more truly about me than you did. And then God concludes, now take 7 bulls and 7 rams and go to my servant Job and sacrifice a burnt offering for yourselves. And let Job, my servant, pray for you. And for him, I will show favor and not treat you vilely, since you have not spoken the truth about me as did my servant Job. Eliphaz the Temanite and Bildad the Shuhite and Sophal the Naamite went and did as the Lord had told them, and the Lord showed favor to Job. The Lord restored Job's fortunes where he prayed on behalf of his friends, and the Lord gave Job twice what he had before. What do you think it means when it says the Lord restored Job's fortunes when he prayed on behalf of his friends? Shouldn't we have heard God restore Job's fortunes? And unrelated as a coda, and also he listened to him when he prayed on behalf of his prayers. Why does God, in your opinion, tie restoring Job's fortunes with Job praying for his friends? What do we make of it? Any thoughts?
Well,
I
it
guess
shows really how great Job is.
Just a
Sorry,
second.
sorry.
Just a second.
No, no.
Several people are talking at once. So Donna, and then who else wanted to say something?
Rebecca, but it's fine. I
Okay,
don't have.
So
Don't.
Donna and then Rebecca. Okay. Yes, Donna.
I guess it's opposite of Sinat Chinam. You know, things were destroyed because of Sinat Chinam, and now things are restored as a result of connection.
You're saying that that there can't be a restoration before there's a certain opening to the other, in a sense.
Right, person to person.
Person to person, yeah. Which is particularly apt here because if we might have thought that this is a book about the relationship between God and man, but really the drama here is between Job and his friends. And what God says is what the friends did, which is put down Job in order to keep their world pure and pristine theologically, is not okay. And in order to correct this world, what we need is an act of chesed from Job to his friends to kind of restore the situation, in a sense. Rebecca?
Well, it sets up this kind of crazy paradigm. Like for a human being to be restored, you have to care about others, but God doesn't have to. God can do whatever God wants, and God can be sadistic, but human beings, we have to think about others first. I mean, I mean, if we just said the human being piece first, that's wonderful, right? But God doesn't function by the same rules that we do. We have to care about others, but God doesn't have to.
Mhm. Do you agree, ladies? Yes, Anne.
I'm not sure I want to agree to that. I I think God is making things happen because he wants it for us.
Mhm.
And I think I think the restoration piece is important, and that part of the restoration, not just for the harmony in the world, but for Job's own self, is that he pray for his friends, that he find that's part of his peacemaking process. And
But if you saw a parent function in this way because they really wanted to teach their child a lesson and really wanted to teach their child how to be a better person, I think you would call children's services.
yes, but that's why I take it as a parable. And because, but we have to understand the end of the story as Job is okay now. Job is the one asking the questions. And it's good to ask the questions, but at some point you have to go on with your life. And you have to, and maybe you spend the rest of your life asking the same questions, but you have to live with the paradox of faith and
Mhm.
fallibility, and I don't know, and I don't understand, and it matters how I act, and it matters to God. I mean, I personally think
Interesting.
that's the same message that Ecclesiastes ends with. That
Right.
our little tiny acts in the world, even though I am going to die, matter to God. What we do in this world matter.
So it's interesting. I don't think we're going to resolve this this question in the next 3 minutes. This is what we have. But I think it's a valid question. And I think both of your positions have validity. And I think that in a sense, in the book itself, God almost says, kind of like Rebecca, my conduct cannot be judged by the same criteria that you understand. It just lies beyond you. And you just have to accept that. On some level, you can't engage with that. This is, you can question, you can demand things, but at the end of the day, this avenue of questioning is by nature unresolvable. You will continue chasing forever. In Plato's Symposium, there's a similar idea about philosophy. The Alcibiades and Socrates agree that, two of the participants in the dialogue agree, that philosophy means love of wisdom. It doesn't mean wisdom. It means you love wisdom, so you keep chasing it, but you'll never catch it, because every time you catch it, you'll just understand better how much you don't understand. And then you'll keep chasing that, and then you'll understand something else, but that'll only open even more avenues of what you don't understand, and so on and so forth. So there it's presented as this joyful pursuit. In Job's case, I think it's far less joyous, but, or in our case, when we grapple with real problems. But in a sense, what the book is telling us is, one, you may engage with it, but be advised you're not going to resolve it, because I, God, lie beyond human understanding. And two, while you go about engaging with it, don't lie. Don't make up answers that make you feel more comfortable at the expense of other people. Don't come up with explanations where if somebody is suffering, it must mean that on some level they're worthy of the suffering. They earned the suffering, just to make yourself feel safe, that you are in a world that makes sense and works and the rules are known and you'll be okay because you're not Job. Don't lie. This is a lie. You can accept that there's a question here that can never be fully resolved. You cannot engage with the question in the first place, but don't try and distort it by making the world an easier place for you to live, by faking it, by making it fake. And three, so if God is if there's three things that God is saying: one, I lie beyond your understanding; two, don't lie to make yourself more comfortable at the expense of other people. And 3, the one duty you have, humanity, is to each other. On some deep level, the job that God says the friends didn't do and that Job should do for them is to be each other's advocates. Because what God says to Job in the end, in the sense, without saying it, is the world will go on, life will be restored, as long as you're an advocate for other people, even for those who wronged you. As long as you continue the tradition of Avraham, who didn't advocate just in the abstract. He advocated for the city of Sodom, for other people, for problematic people, for people who he knew were sinners. As long as you advocate for other people, something can happen. The world can be restored. A path will open up. The world is not grinding to a halt in a whirlwind of destruction. As long as we're each other's advocates, as long as we stand not as each other's accusers, but as each other's defenders in the face of God himself. And this kind of final point, I think, is made all the more poignant when we notice another difference between Ecclesiastes and Job. Because even though both of these books look at the world and say something is wrong with the world, right? There's something wrong here. There's something rotten in the kingdom of Denmark. Ecclesiastes is at its core a very lonely book. There's the I, the person speaking, and he talks about the rest of the world and all the experiences of the world. But we never see him engaging with other people in a meaningful dialogue. And we never see him engaging with God in a dialogue. He doesn't speak to God, he just monologues. He expresses his opinions about the world. And he says things about how people are suffering. Let's look at it for a second. I know I'm running late. We'll finish in a minute. He says things about how sad it is that people are suffering. I farther observed all the oppression that goes on under the sun, the tears of the oppressed with none to comfort them, and the power of their oppressors with none to comfort them. But we don't hear the obvious conclusion of, and therefore I will comfort them. That never happens. It's a book about one person's anguish that remains unresolved at the end because there's nothing out there to resolve it. Job has a way to move past this anguish, has a way to move past his existential questions, because at his core is not just a man facing God, he is a man engaged in society. As he himself says about himself, I was a father to the needy, and I looked into the case of the stranger. He is a man who takes his responsibility for his fellow men very, very seriously. And eventually, it's this responsibility that starts his process of restoration. So even though I have to say that I find it a very difficult book as a believing person to live with, this message, this aspect of this book that talks less about how we square our life with God's presence or justice, etc., but rather that our duty, as God sees it, is first and foremost to be good advocates for each other, I feel it gives me hope. Because it tells me that theology aside, doctrine aside, suffering aside, as long as I'm able to stand up in the morning after all of that and say, what can I do for another person today? Or how can I see another person as a positive in the world today, or speak up for another person today? Then the world will go on. And it'll be imperfect and flawed and difficult, but it'll be a world, it'll be a life. And at the end, this is where the book ends. Not at the place of suffering, not at the place of anguish, but at the place of people reaching out to each other. So I hope I was able to mitigate a little bit the bitterness of this particular book with you.
So
Yeah.
it's hard to express, but I still sort of see there's like layers for transitions. In Avram's time, he directly interacts with God and challenges him at the time of each thing happening, and is told at the time of each thing that, you know, this is what will happen. This is, to some extent, almost, this is why you are going through this. Moshe talks to God, but it's a different level and there's a different point there. And here you have, here and in a sense in Esther, what's kind of like a transition for everybody else. What is it like in the world when you aren't really, even though there is dialogue at the end with Job, what is it like when things are happening and you're not in direct dialogue with God? How can you understand these things? And to a large extent, you can't. And you can't say it's because of this or it's because of that. And so how do you transition from the world when you can have an Abraham who can be in direct contact when God seems to be more, if not involved, but more accessible? And at a certain point for Yisrael, he was more accessible. But now in the later books, that's not the world we're in. And so how do you respond in that world that's not the same world, that's has a somewhat different aspect, or, you know, for most of us, post the time of Abraham and Moshe, and even within the time of the prophets, it's not the same world of this is being established and this is what happens, and there's this direct contact that can at least, if not at least you're getting answers, and there's a dialogue.
Yeah,
You
so
may be
it's,
suffering also, but there's a dialogue and you know why you're suffering.
Yeah.
Or at least you know what's happening. But now you're in a world where that's not the case. Or
you don't know. You don't,
the
he's
world
not
of
given
upon him, or
revelations.
however you want to describe it. So how do you react in that world? And that seems to be what Job is there to describe, if not necessarily completely answer.
Yeah, even though I do want to point out that God does answer in the end of Job, even though
He does in the end.
there are commentators who say that the answer, when we hear that God responds from the whirlwind, it's almost like code to saying that when we encounter the whirlwind of reality, of suffering in reality, we can find God in it in some way. It doesn't need to be direct revelation. I look, it's a huge question, and obviously a question that we can spend our whole life grappling with. I want to say two small points that are related to Job, because we're trying to be on this text. One is that there's a certain how to put it, there's a certain way that the stories in the Torah and the Tanakh in general are structured, where you see the same story echoed in another story. And the commentators, the Midrash, point out that there's a lot of echoes in Iyov from Abraham's life. The fact that he questions God, the fact that he at different times, very, very rich, very, very successful, but also in some ways suffering, going through trials. The fact that he ends his life with many children and good reputation and all that, which is something that's pointedly told about Abraham in Bereshit. And in fact, to the point that there are Parshanim who say that really Iyov is Abraham, is some, version of Abraham, some later life experiences of Abraham. Something I take from that personally is that when I look around in my life or the life of people around me, it reminds me that the stories I see that are sons, God's voice speaking out clearly, on some level are variations on stories that came before them, and stories that came before them, and stories that came before them. And that if I go back deep enough, I might find God's wisdom somewhere in one of those older stories. This is what it means to carry the Torah, God's revelation, with us into history, right? That we use it as a tool to understand our present. We use the past as a tool to understand the present. And when you see that within the Bible itself, it already happens, like an earlier story is almost a key or a map to an older story at a time where there's no or less direct relation, it helps me feel that I'm part of this chain. Another thing more in relation to Megillat Esther, which you mentioned, according to the Midrash, we received the Torah in Mount Sinai, but we only accepted the Torah in the time of Esther, because you can't accept something when you see the truth vividly in front of you. We discussed it in one of our meetings recently. You can only accept something truly if you choose to accept it despite the fact that it's not obviously clear, that it's not just given to you on a silver platter by God himself, by revelation. So this time, when we don't hear God, when we have to grapple with these questions, is an opportunity. It's difficult, it's challenging, but this is where our chapter in history, as human beings grappling with questions that are perhaps bigger than ourselves, but also demand us to rise to new heights of understanding, to new heights of grace, that's our chapter to write. So I find it kind of emboldening. And I feel like Job does that by giving so much dignity to Job himself, by giving such respect to the man who questions and demands and argues for humanity. I feel like he, in that sense, he's a role model for me personally. Okay, we have to finalize here. I mean, we can keep discussing divine justice, I think, for hours, but it is the time. Donna,